Reading and ESL teachers often work with struggling readers who share many characteristics of students in LD programs. So therefore, it's important for you to understand the difference between reading disabilities and dyslexia. What are the most common kinds of reading disabilities? How does it feel to have a learning disability? And I'll also, in this presentation, do an intro to what other conditions may occur with learning disabilities, since it's very common that if a child has one kind of a developmental disorder, there's about a 50% chance that he or she has another. So let's disabuse you of the notion that dyslexia is seeing words backwards, which is what so many people think. People with dyslexia do not see words backwards. Although they may start at the right side of a word instead of at the left, they see words the same way we do. Almost always their difficulty in learning to read has to do with the auditory processing system, not with visual. Dyslexia is the medical term for specific reading disabilities. So, for example, when I worked in a clinic, I would diagnose kids as having dyslexia. When I worked in schools, I diagnosed them as having a specific learning disability or reading disability. Dyslexia is, and so is reading disability in schools, a difference in how the brain processes information. It's a learning difference that requires special teaching and teaching adaptations. On the right-hand side, you see many of the brain processes that are implicated in reading disability. And here is a summary of my dissertation research, looking at differences in brain function for kids with different kinds of reading disabilities compared to normal readers during reading aloud. All of these kids were reading aloud at a frustration level. Even though it looks like those children on the left are asleep, I assure you I was checking their deviations from print. I was listening to them read. So you can see that these kids, now called dysorthographic dyslexics, are very different from the other dyslexic kids that are in the middle and from normal readers. What is not quite as apparent is that the kids with dysphonetic dyslexia are different statistically also from normal readers in the back of the head called the occipital region. What's also important to realize, though, is that dyslexia or reading disability is not a dysfunction of the brain itself. These are the same kids during eyes closed resting. They're not doing any cognitive activity, and statistical analysis does not show any differences in how their brains function when they are not trying to read. So let's do what it feels like to have a reading disability. Before I show you this next reading example, which I want you to struggle through by pausing the recording, I want to assure you that people with dyslexia do not see words the way that they are printed in this next slide. We needed to do this in order to make it hard enough for you to read so you get a simulation of what it feels like to have a reading disability. So pause the recording, and when you've finished, come back to listen to the rest. I'm sure that by this time, if you really did struggle through all of this, you probably have the beginning of a headache. I probably also can guess that if reading were always this difficult for you growing up, that you might not today be a teacher. So let's talk about how many different kinds of reading disabilities there are. First of all, it's important to know that 80% of all students in LD programs are there because of reading disabilities. And of that 80%, the vast majority of them fail to learn how to read. And they have difficulty with basic reading skills. Dysphonetic kids have trouble with decoding. Dysorthographic kids have trouble with automaticity. Together, in my clinical practice, these kids comprise 95% of LD readers. A very small percentage, only 5% in my experience, have a primary reading comprehension deficit rather than comprehension problems due to not being able to read well. These kids who have the primary reading comprehension deficit sound very fluent and expressive. You're sure from after you've heard them read that they're going to clearly understand, but the case is that they don't. They can't answer questions about what they've read. So let's talk about dysphonetic dyslexics. These are kids who guess from context or picture cues. And so as the pictures disappear in second grade and the sentences get more complex, they begin to fail more and more. They generally read rapidly and inaccurately. They have no confidence they're going to be able to sound out a word, so they get in and get out as fast as they can. They will very often substitute words that start with the same letter. They'll go boat for bait, or he opened the goat instead of he opened the gate. Their spelling errors are generally non-phonetic. They would never find them in a spell checker, and sometimes you can't even tell what word they're trying to spell. This is a little dysphonetic reader near the end of second grade. He has been receiving LD services and our literacy clinic services ever since kindergarten. He is reading a story that he's read about 4 times before, and so you can see that he's beginning to crack the code of reading, which is encouraging because there are people who think that if a child has a reading disability, they're never going to be able to read, and that's just not true.
Well, anytime.
Go ahead. Who can hit who will have a big fat net? Man can hit it to Tim. Man when. Oh. Yeah.
Okay, that's enough of Lucas, my grandson, who had dysphonetic dyslexia. He's now a very good reader. This is Luke's spelling in third grade, and you still see how he is still very dysphonetic because he also has dysgraphia, extreme difficulty with printing. I typed the words that he missed over on the right-hand side. And you can see some interesting things like 6 and 7, where he has all of the letters of the word, but they're in the wrong order because he has no sense of how sounds are processed through a word. This is a dysphonetic 8th grade speller. What's really interesting is to see how really behind he still is in spelling. Many of his spelling errors are like those of a first grader. For example, in number 18, he will never find institute in a spell checker because he missed one whole syllable. That's not at all unusual for kids who have dysphonetic spelling. Dysorthographic dyslexics, on the other hand, are very good at decoding. In fact, that's all they really do. They sound out the same word over and over and over. I had one little guy who read the word cub 24 times. By sounding it out, only once did he recognize it, that he had sounded it out previously. So they can't recognize words on sight, they read very slowly, and because of that they generally have difficulty with comprehension of longer texts. They do spell phonetically. You're almost always going to be able to tell what word they're trying to spell. I originally termed them Dysidectic Dyslexics. So here's a little dysorthographic reader. Again, she's near the end of first grade. She has read this particular story about 4 times, so she should be more fluent on it.
Dan saw Mom. Mom said, Hello, Mr. Green. Have that real?
That's not real. That's half.
Have
Half.
have to. I have to take Dan. Dad said.
So here's Jessie, the dysorthographic speller in kindergarten. From looking at this, it's actually the summer before first grade. You would think that she's going to be a wonderful reader, which is exactly what I thought. And yet, here's Jessie at the end of first grade. You can see that you can figure out virtually every single word she's trying to write because they're phonetic, but it's very unusual for end of first grade for a child to still be writing cut as K-U-T rather than C-U-T, and the same thing for cook. Here she is in fifth grade. She's now learned to spell many words orthographically correct, but there's still a lot of spelling by sound. I love her honorable, number 13. And she does a very interesting thing with 14 where she knows the photograph starts with a PH, that's an orthographic concept, and yet she spells the F sound at the end with an F. So let's talk about some of the processing deficits that are associated with reading disabilities. First of all, linguistic deficits. Many kids with reading disabilities have word retrieval problems. They'll go, you know, that thing, stuff. They have trouble rapidly naming common items, like if you ask them to name 4 colors or 4 numbers over and over and over, they're going to start to struggle very quickly, even though they know these colors and these numbers. They often have trouble with organization of thoughts or syntax deficits. Some kids with reading disabilities have difficulty with auditory memory. Not all. Some have excellent auditory memory, but others have extreme difficulty remembering multi-step directions, or as they get older, remembering material from lectures and read-alouds. And then there are the reading deficits, the phonological deficits of dysphonetic kids who back in preschool and kindergarten couldn't segment and blend sounds to make words, and therefore they can't decode. I remember very strikingly the little boy that looked at the words M, A, T and said a, t very, very correctly. And when I said, "Good, Peter, say it fast," he said, "Boy," because he couldn't process the sounds. Then there's the orthographic deficit kids, dysorthographic. They need to decode the same word over and over, and they have difficulty learning to recognize words at sight. These are the common linguistic deficits that you will find in kids with reading disabilities. Now let's do a simulation of what it feels like to have an auditory memory disability. On your worksheet, I'm going to have you follow directions, but do not start until I give you all the directions and then say now. So look at the first row and listen. Put the third letter of the alphabet in the third figure, the 6 in the diamond, the letter L in the first circle, and the number 4 in the triangle, and the last letter of the alphabet in the last figure. Now, you probably are feeling pretty confused. Maybe you didn't even try on that. Let's see how you do on the next one. Cross out the even number in the square, the odd number in the second triangle, and the number in the circle before 12. Now, so if you followed directions, it should look like this, except that I said the last letter in the last figure, so it should have been a Z instead of an A. This is a simulation of what it's like to be 7 or 17 years old and not being able to remember more than 2 or 3 directions at a time. Let's talk about written language deficits. I've already alluded to these with spelling disability. There are kids who are non-phonetic, so even as older students, they may write remember for remember. And then there are the overly phonetic ones. They can't remember the spelling for the non-phonetic words, so they might write physicist for physicist. Then there are those who have written output deficit. They have a big discrepancy between the stories they can tell you and what they can write. They avoid or do poorly on writing assignments, and they may have dysgraphia, which is difficulty making the motor movements needed to produce legible and correct letters. Their brain literally has to tell them overtly how to make the letters. I'm going to give you a simulation of what it's like to have dysgraphia. Put a plain sheet of paper on top of your head and draw a circle for a face. Take your hand away, go back up and draw the left eye. Take your hand away again, go back up and put in the mouth. Take your hand away again. This time put in the left eye. Take your hand away again. And now the nose. When you take the picture down and look at it, it's probably all cattywampus. And much as you enjoy looking at this, think about the difficulty if you would have if you, every time you wanted to write a letter or write a word, you had to think about it as deliberately as you did in order to draw this picture. Many kids who are not identified as having a reading disability have dysgraphia, and it really impacts their ability and their willingness to write. I do find that using iPads and electronic devices as soon as kids are able to do that is a good workaround for them. What I want you to know, though, is that successful intervention normalizes brain function. What you see here in this schematic is a new group of normal readers, and in the middle are 4 of my remediated dyslexics. It's now 3 years later, and 4 of these dysphonetic kids can now read at their expected grade level. I now have a whole new group of unremediated dysphonetic kids who are recorded here. And you'll notice from the arrows that both the normal readers and the remediated dysphonetics differ from the unremediated dysphonetics, while the remediated dysphonetics do not differ from normal readers. This is what's really exciting, and other labs have also found that in the ensuing years since we did this study, that effective intervention normalizes brain function. That's pretty cool. For those of you who are working with kids who are struggling, remember this picture. So coming up next, in the next presentation, I'll be talking about the co-occurrence of learning disabilities, ADHD, and gifted and talented.